that a lot of people seem to, i- the assumption is that pronunciation is accent. And the term that I heard in the conversation that we had with Gemma and Robin was intelligibility, which is a principle that you wrote in a paper in, I think, in 2005, if I'm not mistaken, where you basically
Yes.
contrasted the nativeness principle with the intelligibility principle. And you're basically suggesting that pronunciation has been at the realm of the former. So I think what would be really interesting for a lot of people who listen to this podcast, a lot of teachers who are not familiar with that, I think perhaps could you could you walk us through, first of all, how you conceptualize? I'm very interested in the genesis of ideas. Like, how did you come up with this idea of calling it and coining this as the intelligibility principle versus the other one, the nativeness principle? So perhaps talk a little bit about the genesis of that, John, as well as, of course, the fireworks here, um, as well as the difference. Walk us through the two of them. So I think so teachers do understand that a lot of them who are still teaching to sound like a native speaker, this actually comes from a very specific approach to pronunciation. So I'd appreciate if you could do that.
The intelligibility principle came out of a lot of different things. When I was first a pronunciation teacher, um, nativeness was the focus. But I was at University of Illinois, and the head of our department or our division was Raj Khatru, who is a famous researcher in world Englishes.
Hmm.
And he was Indian and argued that the Englishes around the world that are different from the ones that get prestige status were every bit as systematic and valid as those ones that end up in um, Cambridge and Oxford textbooks. And that made a lot of sense, and it made a big difference in how I thought about pronunciation. And so I had this idea of world Englishes and intelligibility, that it became important only to have the ability to understand each other, not that everyone should talk like me, or talk like you, or talk like Gemma. That each person had an accent, but as long as we could understand each other, we didn't have any right to impose a different accent on other people. Um, so that's kind of where the genesis
Hmm.
of intelligibility came from. And that came from that 2005 article, which was part of a special issue for TESOL Quarterly. Um, and My colleague, Carol Chappell, who was the editor of TESOL Quarterly at that point, and I pitched this idea to her at the time that I'd like to do this special issue on pronunciation, and that I wanted to do on intelligibility and world Englishes and identity, which were the three issues that were kind of central to my thinking. And I thought I would do it in about 3 years, and Carol asked me to give her a proposal the following week. Um, and and so I did that. Um, and that short article that you're talking about, the that has the intelligibility principle and the nativeness principle, came about kind of by mistake.
What do you mean?
Um,
Okay.
I I had all of the articles that had come in for the special issue. And I had never done any editing before this. Um, and I found out that I had to write a front piece for the the journal special issue.
Uh,
And so I had to kind of pull together these three areas of identity in world Englishes and intelligibility. Um, and I wrote the front piece for it. Um, and I'm still surprised today because I've gone back and read it a number of times. Um, it's actually pretty
it
good
is very well written, very well written.
and short,
Nice.
which is
Yes,
really even better.
yes.
Um, and it kind of fell into place that this issue um, of how we thought about pronunciation. That if you think of it in terms of accent, then ultimately you're making decisions about who's best.
Mm,
You have to make that decision because you for a pronunciation teacher's point of view, you put together a way of speaking as a model.
mm,
And um, if you're thinking in terms of intelligibility, then what you're saying is that all models are valid as long as they are mutually understandable. Inside this kind of decision, there was also the influence of Jennifer Jenkins' work when she did her book in 2000 on the phonology of English as an international language. And Jenny's work looked at how people who were second language speakers of English interacted with other second language speakers of English. And this is one of those places that is a little scary for a pronunciation teacher because you could likely say it doesn't matter,
mm,
right?
yeah.
People don't need to pronounce in any kind of convergent way. But that's not what she found. What she found was that when people interacted using English, even though English was not the native language of either of the interlocutors, they often had trouble understanding each other. They were not intelligible, in other words. And there were certain pronunciation features that seemed to be the key to this. And so I think that was another part of what had brought me to this point of seeing these kind of two
Mm,
pieces. Do you want to have a native like accent? That's the nativeness principle. Do you need to have a native like accent? And I think the answer to that is obviously no, because there are lots of native accents. Um, they're not necessarily mutually intelligible, and they're not necessarily better than the others. So ultimately, you need to simply see pronunciation as a way that allows you to communicate.
yeah.
And if you can communicate, if you're intelligible, that's what's necessary. You shouldn't make other people do things that you wouldn't do yourself.
Mm. It's it's very interesting, John, because I have to say this. Growing up, I was somewhat forced to adopt a certain pronunciation model. And that was an American model because I was studied in American English. I was exposed to American English. My teachers corrected me and somewhat indoctrinated a way of communicating that somewhat was mimicking an American accent. And that
Mm-hmm.
in a way, um, really affected me in the sense that I felt that if I could not say a certain word following a certain pattern of pronunciation, I would always be caught. I always felt like, oh, somebody's going to catch me. Someone is going to find out that I am this or I'm not a no native speaker or this or that. But eventually, I was able to kind of rid myself of this. I didn't even know at the time because it was the beginning of my teaching career, the nativeness principle. But what you said is very true, that one way of speaking is not better than others. And but here's the question I have for you. And you wrote this in the paper that there is, I think the words you used were exactly this. There's an overwhelming amount of evidence against the nativeness principle, but it still affects pronunciation practice. It's still somewhat pervasive. We still have people advertising themselves or schools advertising that we can help you sound like a native speaker, even though we know this is not possible. I think my question to you then is, even though we have an awareness, which I think hopefully after this episode, the intelligibility principle will spread even more so amongst educators, language educators. But John, why is the nativeness principle? I actually have a theory, but I'll talk about this later. Why is the nativeness principle still pervasive in language education? Why is it still here? It's 2024.
It's the easiest way to think about pronunciation. We think about pronunciation as those who do it perfectly, whatever that means,
Right.
versus those who are going to be caught. And with accent, everybody gets caught.
Yes. Yes.
It takes almost no talent whatsoever for a listener to say, "You don't sound like me.
Yes.
I can't fit you into my native box. You must be somebody who doesn't speak English or Spanish or whatever language you're talking about. Um, you don't speak it natively." And you just it's very easy to catch anybody
Yeah.
because there's so many little pieces that um, are tells. Okay, even for people who are amazing,
Yeah.
um, you just you can't avoid it. There are people who can avoid it, but not very often.